Hey guys, what is going on? Shah here, and we are back today with another Guardian Druid video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Azerite traits. We left off last video talking about talents and breaking down everything in the talent tree for Guardian Druids and kind of what we're looking to run talent-wise. This is going to play a big part on what Azerite traits are going to be popular for us. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down all of the Guardian Druid specific Azerite traits along with some more general ones that you might still want to run. Some ones that you might not even think about running that might be in different trees. For example, there's some Feral and Resto Azerite traits that can be popular and can be utilized and were utilized in previous seasons. And then I'm going to kind of talk about what is meta and why it is meta. So I'm hoping that this kind of sums it up quick. I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible because I tend to rant for a long time. So we're going to jump right in here. Hope you enjoy. So looking at Guardian Druid as a whole, we have 6 Azerite traits that are spec specific. They include Layered Mane, Twisted Claws, Masterful Instincts, Burst of Savagery, Gory Regeneration, and Guardian's Wrath. Most of these, I can say, are fairly decent. Blizzard did a fairly good job at playing into some of the different perks of Guardian Druid, kind of capitalizing on what we do well, and also filling in some of those gaps that we need. So for example, like uptime on mitigation, or just having increased mastery and just having a really beefy health pool and pretty insane healing. Guardian Druid this patch has definitely felt more or less like a Blood DK, but a little bit sturdier because we actually have armor, unlike Blood DKs. So to start it off, I guess we'll talk about Twisted Claws. This is going to be your stackable trait that you're going to want to aim for 3 of. Most builds will be running 3 of this. Some run 2, but I would recommend 3. The only time you would really replace Twisted Claws is if you're running like Heart of Darkness, for example, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But Twisted Claws, essentially what it does is that your Thrash is direct damage, so every time you use the ability, it's not going to be affected by the bleed effect that you're applying to your targets. So the direct damage has a 50% chance to grant you agility based on the level of the Azerite gear for 12 seconds, and this stacks up to 5 times. So if you have 3 stacks of this, you're going to look upwards of like 4,000 agility, or up to 4,000 agility, which is just absolutely massive. Agility is one of our strongest stats, and it's going to make you feel extremely sturdy without having to rely on your mitigation uptime. So definitely aim for 3 of these. Next we have Layered Mane. Layered Mane is obviously another popular one. This is going to give you agility when you have Iron Fur stacks, and then it also has a 10% chance to grant 2 applications of Iron Fur instead of just the 1. So it's a little bit of a coin flip. Obviously 10% chance seems very low, but it has a meaningful impact for how often Guardian Druids can actually use their Iron Fur. So this 10% won't stack though. So if you're stacking 2 or 3 of these traits, you're not going to have a 30% chance or 20% chance. It'll always be 10. So running one of these is typically preferred, but you never really do more than that. Now, because agility is so strong, some Guardian Druids do like to run 2 Iron Furs. I've seen people try 3. I just think that Twisted Claws is going to give you so much better uptime and higher amount of agility. So definitely want one of these just for mitigation uptime purposes. So now we're getting into the kind of the gray area of Guardian Druid. These traits, I don't want to put them down in any way. They are good traits. Some of them are stronger than others. Some are more raid specific. Some are more like lower level specific, I guess. But when you're starting to get high keys, I guess there's really 2 that are going to really make an impact. And that's, I'm going to start with Masterful Instincts. So Masterful Instincts is a trait that I like to run. And essentially what it does is it increases your mastery by a fairly large amount, upwards of 1,000, depending on the Azerite piece that it's on. And your armor after your Survival Instincts ends. Survival Instincts is our big DR. It's a 50% DR for 6 seconds. When this expires, then for 30 seconds, we're going to take increased healing and be a little bit tankier. Again, not having to worry about uptime as much on our Iron Fur. So this turns our 6-second DR into kind of like a pseudo like 36-second DR, which is extremely nice, especially when you're running Vision of Perfection build. Essences I haven't really talked about yet, but Vision of Perfection is a fairly popular major trait, which is going to give you constant procs, and it's going to reduce the cooldown of your Survival Instincts. So it feels like you're going to have a very high uptime from this. And then obviously the mastery is just great to have, so fairly strong. Now, on the other end, you have Burst of Savagery, and this is going to be more of a consistent uptime. So every time you consume Gore, which is a proc you're going to gain from just doing damage, your Mangle is going to refresh and generate more rage. And when you consume this Gore stack or buff, it's going to give you 600 mastery, or that might go up a little bit depending on what item level of Azerite you have. It's going to give you some mastery for 5 seconds, and it's going to have a 15% chance to reactivate Gore, which is pretty strong in single target rotations and on boss fights. So Tyrannical Weeks, this is actually a fairly strong ability. What it basically does is turn your Mangle, when you see that Mangle light up, that is almost as a defensive, because when you hit that, you're going to be gaining mastery for 5 seconds. So increased healing and increased armor / attack power. So fairly strong one. I do run one of these currently. I'm looking to trade out of it, or like trade off for like a Heart of Darkness, but since I don't raid, I don't have access to those on my Druid currently, but hoping to in the future. So now we have the last 2 traits for Guardian Druid, and they're kind of in a gray area right now. I don't find them to be that great. So we have Gory Regeneration, which Mangle extends the duration of your active Frenzied Regeneration by 1 second, up to 3 seconds. And then your Frenzied Regen also restores additional health, depending on, obviously, your Azerite item level. So the issue with this is that oftentimes you're only going to get to use 1 Mangle in this window, so it's only going to extend by 1 second. And it's a fair bit of amount of healing, but if your healer's doing their job, typically your Frenzied Regen is actually going to cap you on your health, or it should be, unless you're like extremely low. This can be a decent trait when you're running like Guardian of Elune, which is a talent that I talked about in my last video, and Incarnation as a talent. So those synergize very well, and it can allow you to heal for just an outrageous amount. But this is typically something you might see in Raid. In Mythic Plus, not as viable, just because Frenzied is constantly on cooldown, and typically you're not using Mangle in large trash pools, like almost ever. So just not a very strong trait. That doesn't see a lot of uptime. And then lastly, we have Guardian's Wrath. This causes Maul to deal additional damage, and then Maul, every time you Maul, it reduces the cooldown of your Iron Fur by 15 rage, second up to 3 times. So essentially, if you Maul 3 times, your next Iron Fur is basically free, which is great, except it's not. So this is more of a raid trait. When you can spend that rage you're gaining on Mauls because you're off tanking, great. But because you have the uptime and the damage that you're taking, it's very hard to justify spending even just 1 Maul even in like in an AoE pool in a dungeon, than actually just going right into Iron Fur. Oftentimes you're relying on Thrash and Swipe to do a lot of your damage. Unless there's like explosive weeks or something like that, Guardian's Wrath just isn't very strong. In lower keys, it's okay. Again, it is okay to use this trait, but I would look to replace it if you can. A lot of that damage you're going to be gaining is actually going to come through just pure item level, your agility, and then also having just a good solid 475 weapon, or like a raid weapon or something with good corruption on it. So that pretty much does it for the general traits for Guardian Druid. Now I do want to quickly talk about some of the notable tier 1 traits that aren't necessarily Guardian Druid specific. So we have 4 of them. We have Heart of Darkness, which is new with the Nyalotha gear. It is only present on the Nyalotha gear, so you have to be currently raiding. You can access it on LFR pieces all the way up to Mythic. So obviously Mythic is going to be the highest end. If you can get your hands on a heroic piece though, still a very good choice. So Heart of Darkness, it increases your secondary stats by roughly like 80, just again depends on item level, while your corruption is 25 or higher. Now this is the key component. If you're running less than 25 corruption, this isn't going to have a trait, and it's basically an empty slot, so you're going to want to trade it out for a different Azerite trait. But if you are running more than 25, which most people are at this point, this is a very strong secondary stat boost. So some Guardian Druids like to run 1 of these or 2 of these if you can get your hands on it. It's kind of difficult to run 3 just because the Twisted Claws and the Layered Mane requirements, but again, very notable, strong tier 1 Azerite trait. We also have a few in the different trees. So we have a Resto Druid Azerite trait called Waking Dream, and what this allows is what it causes is your Ysera's Gift will now heal every 4 seconds instead of every 5, and it's going to heal an additional amount for each rejuve out. So if you're fairly good at keeping your rejuvenations up on your group or yourself, and having the Resto Infinity, this is going to be a fairly significant boost in DPS or HPS in your overall run. So fairly strong trait. This was very popular in previous seasons, not so much now, but I think it's still viable if you were looking to fill something out, or if you want to try to pump out a little bit more healing. We also have Wild Flesh Rending, which the first part of this doesn't really matter because you're not going to be in cat form or running Feral Affinity, really. But your Shredder will deal additional damage if you're running it. But the big thing about this is that your swipe deals an additional 1,000 damage to every enemy suffering by your Thrash. So running one of these, or even up to 3 of these, is very, very fun on like fortified teaming weeks or just lower key levels that you might be farming out gear for. Just a very fun piece to run, or a very fun Azerite trait to run, because it allows you to pump AoE damage without relying on corruption, like Echoing Void or Violent Devastation. And lastly, a trait that I think is a little ignored, or a little bit of a sleeper, it's called Power of the Moon. This was actually buffed recently, or I guess this wasn't buffed, but your Moonfire dot was buffed as of 8.3 by 11%. So Moonfire deals an additional 300 roughly periodic damage, and has a chance to grant Lunar Empowerment. Now the Lunar Empowerment, obviously, unless you're running Balance Affinity, which you shouldn't be, but if you are, you're also probably not Moon Conform, so it doesn't really matter. But the Moonfire damage is now increased by like an additional like 20%. And if you're running a Galactic Guardian build, this can be very, very strong for overall damage through the course of the whole course of the dungeon. Now the problem with the last two that I just mentioned, this one and Wild Flesh Rending, is that they don't offer any defensive value like all of the other traits have offered so far. So that's kind of something you have to keep in mind. If you feel like you are just an absolute beast and you're just taking everything to the face and you're not really suffering too much, feel free to run these. Now, if you are getting beat up a lot and you're starting to get to that point where you feel like you're taking too much damage, you might want to swap off of these traits if you're running them, and maybe go into something like Masterful Instincts or Bursts of Savagery for a little bit extra mastery. But that pretty much does it for the Tier 1 Azerite traits. So both Guardian specific and just notable Tier 1 that aren't necessarily Guardian Druid specific and more are kind of baseline or for different specs. So let's take a dive into our Tier 2. So our Tier 2 is that third ring in. This is going to have like things like Overwhelming Power, Elemental Whirl, Earthlink, Azerite Veins, but pretty much anything that's not those four you don't really want to be running. Heed My Call is okay. Gut Ripper is all right for obviously offensive gain, but defensive gain, those four I just mentioned. So Overwhelming Power is going to give you a pretty significant haste proc. Elemental Whirl is just going to proc random secondary stats. Earthlink is going to fluctuate agility back and forth, up and down, but just it's pretty much a flat stat stick. And then your Azerite Veins is going to give you some good healing. This is if you're feeling like you need a little bit more defensive value from your Azerite compared to offensive value or secondary stat value. There are some other Tier 2 traits that are fairly like okay to run, but on your best in slot gear, you're going to pretty much find these traits. So there's nothing really to talk about with the other ones. Now, if you guys do have questions if something's worth running, obviously let me know in the comment section below, and I'd be love to talk about that and answer that for you. And then lastly, we're looking at Tier 3 now. If you've paid attention to tanking at all, especially this tier, Impassive Visage is going to be by far the most, the best trait that you can possibly run defensively. Its uptime is insane, especially for tanks, because you're constantly taking damage. Basically, this is going to be proccing on cooldown every 6 seconds. I'm fortunate enough to have 3 right now, and it's doing, like, I'm a Guardian, I mean, obviously, like, Guardian Druids do an insane amount of healing, but it's doing, like, 10% of my overall healing for a key. And this also will be buffed by your mastery. So you're going to get that kind of like secondary value from it, because you're getting the heal, but it's also then proccing your Nature's Guardian. So very, very strong one. Now, obviously, you can always take Resounding Protection. You can take Bulwark. Ursoc's Endurance is fairly okay every time you use Barkskin, but this plays more into like if you're running Survival of the Fittest kind of build with Brambles. But Impassive Visage, if you can get that on a piece, you are golden. If you can get it on all 3 pieces, you don't need a healer pretty much. There's times where I can run like 17s without even like the healer doesn't have to do anything. They can run all TDs and just DPS to their heart's content. I do want to quickly look at, I want to talk about what the meta is looking like currently for Guardian Druids when it's concerning Azerite traits. Now, this is a crazy cool site. It's called mythicplus.subcreation.net or mplus.subcreation.net, but this is a compilation of basically all of the Raider IO information that you need. Now, there's a lot of stuff here. I'm not going to go over everything. Maybe in a future video I'll talk about stuff, but what we're going to be looking at is actually where Guardian Druid is currently. So right now we are, at least for this week, which I'm recording this, it's a Tyrannical Teeming Volcanic Awaken Route A week. Now, it's looking at all of the top runs of every class, where they're standing between, you know, key level 16 and 24 or 25 or whatever the max is, and it's seeing how they're performing IO based. This is purely based off of IO and where the healers sit. It's a good way to figure out comps and what you're going to be looking at. But long story short, we're going to be actually clicking on Guardian Druid here, and we're going to be able to see what people are running. So you can look at talent builds here, which I talked about in the last video. You can talk about essences, or look at essences, which I will be talking about in a future video. Hopefully it won't take as long as this one, but we'll obviously have to see about that. But it even goes over Azerite traits and items and trinkets and corruptions and corruption builds. Very cool site. Highly recommend it if you have a chance to look at it. And then this is what I'm pretty much talking about in this video. So you're going to see a whole variety of different Azerite combinations that are being ran, but you can see some very good similarities. So you're going to see triple Twisted Claw almost all the time. There's this one outlier, the 2% population only running one Twisted Claws and a bunch of other random traits. This is just someone who's probably running so much Twilight Devastation that it doesn't even matter. But if you look at the top 80% of players, you're going to see a very similar place, or similar kind of combination of essences or Azerite traits. You're going to see a different combination of Azerite traits. So like I said, we're going to be running triple Twisted Claw, very, very popular. Now again, you're looking at a 155 agility plus times 3. So now we're looking at like 500 agility, 300, I can't math, like 450 agility, right in that range, times 5. So you're going to have like an insane amount of like 3k plus agility. I don't know what they're scaling this Azerite trait at, but 3 of these is going to make you extremely tanky. Obviously, one layered main is going to be very common. You'll sometimes see 2 pop up in here, but it's typically 1 just because Heart of Darkness came into play. So Heart of Darkness, secondary stats, very, very strong. You're still going to see things like Masterful Instincts and Burst of Savagery being ran, but you're not going to see a lot of Gory Regen, and you're not going to see a lot of those Guardian's Wraths in here. You're going to see some of these like random, like Clockwork Heart. That's fairly strong because you're getting a lot of secondary stats for 12 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. But this is going to be the builds that you're going to be looking at. So this is the meta, and that is why. It's simply because you're getting just an insane amount of agility, so you're getting an insane amount of your best stat, especially when you're running like a Vision of Perfection build or you're running Incarnation. During your window of Incarn, you are untouchable by the mobs because your agility is just so high, you're healing for so much. And then this layered main is just going to give you really, really good uptime on your Iron Fur. It's typically never going to fall off, unlike previous seasons where it would fall off quite often. And then Heart of Darkness is just good for secondary stats. Crit is good. Haste allows you to have a little bit faster globals. Your Mastery is going to increase your overall health and attack power. And then Versatility is just going to reduce your damage increase the damage you're doing and reduce the damage you're taking. All very good stats. But I will be breaking down secondary stats in a future video, and I will also be breaking down essences in a future video. But this is what the meta is looking like, and if you guys do have a chance, I definitely recommend checking out this Mythic Plus sub creation. It's a very good way to look at kind of what people are running compositions, what keys are good on given weeks, and it's just a great tool to have in your back pocket. So, well, that pretty much does it. That sums up this video. I'm sorry it took so long, guys, but it's just been pretty hectic in life. So if you guys do have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let me know in the comment section below, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Take care.